My first
Sorry, forgot to record it. Keep going, sorry.
my first internship was with a marketing coach, and she really helped me introduce what it means to be a graphic designer and to work with a sole proprietor. And so under her, I learned more about social media management and creating graphics for social media, as well as some package designing. And then some of my other internships, I worked with an ad agency called R2 Media in Tustin. And with them, it was really cool because I actually got to assist with some of their car dealership commercial videos, as well as get a sense of e-blast designing and more social media. And so with each of my internships, each one, I've had about maybe 8, including my internships in college as well as after college. And each one has really taught me something different. Some have taught me how to work with more of like a startup, sole proprietors, as well as more established companies.
Very nice. Thank you for sharing that information with us. Sorry, I was just letting a few more students into our meeting from the waiting room. So our third question for you is, what is your educational background, and does that play into your career? And if so, how?
Yeah, so when I was in uni, I went to a liberal arts college, and there I learned more of the graphic design courses as well as business. And, even now that I've graduated, I have looked back sometimes and figured, should I have gone to an art school instead? Because sometimes I feel like I do lack in certain areas, but at the same time, I don't think I made the wrong decision, because had I gone to an art school, I wouldn't have gotten the business classes I had experienced today, as well as through my university, I was also able to study abroad. And through that aspect, I took even more business classes and was able to network with students that were international.
Well, that's an amazing opportunity. What does your typical work day look like for you then?
So at the moment, due to COVID, it's been kind of iffy, but I work for a company that's up in Vacaville, California. So I do a lot of remote work. And typically before COVID, we would have weekly calls and establish what we should do for our social media. And then we were about to start a project on updating their website as well.
Okay, and so you can do all of that remotely then? Is that difficult to do those types of projects remotely?
It's not that bad, because a lot of the work as a graphic designer, you can do it either on site or at home. What is the most challenging thing for me working with them is the fact that I am remote though, so I don't get to go into the office every day.
Okay. Okay, so then our next question for you is, what do you enjoy the most about what you do?
So I know myself as a very creative person. So as a graphic designer, I get to experience that every day. And even in college, what I really appreciated about graphic design is the more advertising psychology of it, and how just a simple graphic or a simple typography can influence a person in purchasing a product. So that type of stuff really fascinates me.
Very cool. Thank you for that answer. And so then our sixth question that we have for you is, what do you enjoy the least? Or is there something that surprised you about this role when you first started?
Surprisingly, okay, so my role technically right now is a marketing consultant, even though I do a lot of graphic design aspects of it. And most of my internships, I've dealt with social media management, and I've learned to not like it as much, but it has definitely helped me figure out, okay, how to effectively advertise through social media as well as just digitally.
Okay. Sounds good. And you weren't aware that you wouldn't like that as much? You thought that you would like it more?
Going into it, I thought I would like it more, but I've kind of discovered I'm more into kind of web design or logo design, kind of those, or just print media rather than just restricting it to social media.
Okay. And then our seventh question for you, what skills do you use regularly for your job?
So with the company I work for, it's a lot of the number one skill is time management. Because I work remotely, I have to keep track of my hours, and then I'll send them my invoice and stuff. But it's more of how can I effectively get the job done in a certain amount of time, but present them with something that's very professional. So that is something to keep in mind, as well as just the basics of a graphic designer like Photoshop, InDesign, Illustrator. And there's been some web design programs as well as some video editing programs as well.
What are some of those? Well, I think actually that's one of my later questions. But if you could just share a little bit about the video editing platforms that you have used.
I usually use Premiere Pro, sometimes After Effects, but not as much.
Okay. Okay. Are those difficult platforms to use, or are they pretty user-friendly?
They can be pretty intimidating. When I was in college, I did take a course strictly on each of those. So that helped a lot. But once you kind of get the hang of, especially like Photoshop, InDesign, Illustrator, it's not as intimidating when you're learning about like Premiere Pro and After Effects.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you. And then our 8th question, your resume includes multiple graphic design roles with several different companies, and you also do your own freelance work. Can you please share about your experience between corporate and freelance graphic design work?
Yeah, so I personally prefer corporate because it is more stable, and you get to work with, in some cases, you get to work with teams of different fields. So I used to intern at this one company where I was in the marketing department, but I also would sometimes have meetings with the engineers and like some of the tech team and such. So that was pretty cool to experience. With as a freelance artist, you do have that creative freedom, which is nice. So you get to cater it to more of your personal artistic ability and what you're interested in. The problem with that though, and this kind of goes with even just applying for jobs in general and interviews, is you got to be careful of scams. I've had a couple interviews where they were scams, and it was kind of obvious at first because they wanted to do an interview, but only through Google Hangouts, and it was only through chat. So that's like the first red flag. And how quickly they got back to me on like, oh, you're all of a sudden hired. Let's go ahead. We have a discount on office supplies. You can work from home. You just got to send us money. And so that is a big red flag. Never send just a stranger money like that. And then at the beginning of COVID, I've also had people contact me through my contact form on my website and say, hey, could you design a logo for us? And it was very suspicious at first because 3 people sent me that email within 2 days. And the way their English was very poor to begin with. And then I was working on one of the logos for them, and I sent it to them, and they said, okay, great, we sent your check in the mail. We accidentally combined it with our like print design, the print company. Could you deposit the check and then send that money to them? So that's also a big red flag, because what can happen is the check can bounce, and in reality, the money that you just sent to the other company is actually what you're paying them. So in reality, you lose money instead of gain it. So you have to be careful about those type of scams as well.
So I know this isn't one of the questions that we were pre-planning on asking you, but what are some specific red flags when it comes to scamming that our students should be aware of if they're wanting to get into graphic design work? You said broken English.
Yeah, broken English. And so with one of the contacts, I told them, hey, what I can do is I can rip the check and you can resend me the check with the amount that I requested. And the way he replied was very unprofessional, and the English he almost sounded like a child in a sense that like, this is upsetting me, what you agreed to at first, sending off the check or depositing the check and stuff like that. So it's just a lot of things that your gut kind of tells you like this is off.
Yeah. Wow, interesting. I never knew that was out there, or a part of being a graphic designer is being aware of the scams that could be out there for you.
Yeah, and I did some research with those specific people, and the number I had was a Texas number, and then there was another company that was supposedly in Ohio. So it's not just like international people trying to scam you. It can also be domestic.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up in today's BizChat. That's good for our students to be aware of in this industry. So thank you. So then that kind of leads, I guess, into our next question is, what are some of your biggest day-to-day challenges that you face?
Well, with the current company I'm with, it's just the fact of being remote. And because I handle the social media, that I can't just casually go into the office and take photos for them. I have taken a couple business trips up there and taken footage for them, but it's kind of hard when I'm managing their social media and trying to come up with content when I'm not physically there.
Yeah, that would be difficult. Do you have a team, or is it just you doing that work?
At the moment, it's just me and the HR manager.
Okay. So students, we have about 3 questions left for Mariah. If you guys have any questions for her, feel free to add them in the chat. If not, then once I finish my questions, then we'll be done with the question portion of our BizChat, okay? So question number 10 for you. What design platforms do you use regularly, and what ones would you encourage students to know well if they want to go into this career field?
So as what most companies are looking for a graphic designer, you at least need to know Photoshop, InDesign, and Illustrator. Those are the big 3. If you kind of want to stand out more, there are and it also depends on what field you're looking into. So for example, Lightroom, that's really good for photo editing. There's also Premiere Pro and After Effects. What I have also learned is, because I'm more into web designing as well, I use WordPress. And with the company I'm currently working for, they use Shopify. So I'm starting to get a little bit familiar with them.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. And then would you recommend students also get familiar with that video software you mentioned, the different platforms for that, or is that something only if they're wanting to go into like videography?
I think it's something good to know as a graphic designer, but if you want to pursue videography, then definitely look into those.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. And so then question 11, you have had multiple graphic design internships. Can you share with us the value you see in interning?
Yeah, so because I've had so many internships, and I'll be honest, each one has taught me something different. There's even for the most part, most graphic design internships, they're gonna be for free. You're not gonna get paid, and that's okay because you're in college, you're learning, and this is really the moment where you can afford to, work for free in that sense, because you're trying to build your career and establish things.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. Thank you. So we have a question from a student who's wanting to know if you can explain or describe your creative process.
Yeah, so when I typically work for a client, whether it's just one of my colleagues saying, hey, like, hey, could you design me a logo or something like that, or with an actual company, I sit down with them, talk about, like, do they have a brand concept already in mind, as in, do they have the color codes that they prefer, and all the specifics that relate to their brand image. And then after that, I'll do some sketches with them and kind of see what they're looking for. To be specific with logo designing, I'll do some research ahead of time to see what kind of product that they want to advertise and get a feel of, okay, this is the image that they want, and these are typically the images of what that industry looks like. And then from there, I create about at least 5 different rough drafts for them to choose from and see if any certain elements are preferred to them or not, what they do like, what they don't, and then kind of narrow it down from there with them.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. So then I have one last question for you here. Students, this is the last question I have for Mariah. So if you have any other questions, make sure you put them in the chat. My last question for you is, what advice would you give students who are interested in following your career path?
I'd say definitely network, because even now, I have, with the previous companies I've worked for, I've had ex-coworkers reach out to me and say, hey, we're kind of running behind on this certain project. Could you just do a quick thing for us? and I'll do it and send it off their way. So it's really like even at your even the internships that you do for free, there's always room for opportunity. They may want you back and it could end up being paid. So that's the number one thing. And also finding your niche, kind of like, okay, what is it that you like? What do you not like? For me personally, I'm not much of a social media advertising person, but I do like logo designing and web designing. So it's kind of like finding what areas of interest do you have, and then also what industry, because I have some friends that are graphic designers looking into more of just museum like expeditions, and they want to end up working for museums only. I have some friends that work more in the animation field, and it just kind of depends. Like I personally would rather work in like a marketing agency, for example. So it's kind of like, where do you want to end up?
Mm-hmm. And then we have, I was just curious, you mentioned your business, your education with business and marketing. So then how has that affected you and your freelance work with determining your pricing and how much things cost, and even knowing how to like invoice a company professionally? Like how has that experience influenced you in your business?
Yeah, so definitely learning marketing in college has helped me with being a freelancer, and it's really set up to be like, okay, so what is the service that they're asking for? Because what you request for a logo design would be different for something like a web design. So you have to kind of figure out your rates. When I was still in college, I just made a starting point because like you can do all the research you want, and with graphic designers, each graphic designer prices their work differently. So for me, my starting point was $20 an hour for just like a logo design. Now I charge more like 30 to 35. So it kind of like, as your experience grows, then you can have the flexibility to add more money.
And then because you went from studio design into graphic design work, was there ever a point where you were discouraged in becoming a graphic designer? And if so, how did you overcome that discouragement when you're starting in a new field?
Oh, definitely. So as like a freshman in college, I was so used to studio art, it was completely different from digital art, and which was very intimidating for me because I had the aspects of a studio artist. Like I had form down, I could draw and all that stuff, but it was so different compared to like drawing on a tablet, for example. And honestly, just practice. I practiced a lot and then became more familiar. The classes I took, specifying in each of those Adobe programs, definitely helped a lot. Like I'll look back at some of my work freshman year in college and I'll just cringe because it's just like, oh, that really looked pretty poorly drawn and stuff. But it's kind of like you kind of have to practice with it and just let the bad artistic stuff come out.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. Thank you. So then I just have one more question as I've just been listening to you here on the BizChat. In your experience, have you ever had or dealt with someone who wasn't satisfied with your work? And if so, how did you overcome that issue or that customer complaint?
Yeah, so I've worked for even some of my companies I've worked for. One of them was a studio, a fitness studio, and working with my boss was also technically the owner. And what was challenging for her is she would tell me one thing to do and then tell me the complete opposite after I would show her what she wanted, because she didn't really know what she wanted. So it was definitely challenging to kind of get across to her, but eventually we would like combine ideas and over time, and just you have to communicate and talk it out and then kind of see kind of what they're looking for, even though they can't verbally describe it.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like sometimes it's difficult when where you have to kind of stand up for yourself and say, this is the work I produced, like this is the invoice now that goes with the work that I produced? Or do you feel like,
Yeah.
mm-hmm,
So I've had it a couple times where I will send somebody like my different drafts, and I'll have a personal favorite because, you know, I created them and know which ones are just visually stronger. And of course they choose the one that I least like, but at the end of the day for them, it's what makes them happy and they're the customer. So you kind of just have to let it happen, and then whichever draft you liked better, put that in your portfolio.
Yeah, sounds good. And then what constitutes an actual like professional portfolio?
So on my experience, especially with job hunting, they'll often request for graphic designers to send a link of their portfolio as in their website. So I definitely recommend creating your own website, because that not only showcases your portfolio as a whole, it also showcases that, hey, I can design a website too.
How did you design your first website? What kind of platforms did you use, or,
I used WordPress. I actually took
WordPress?
a class in college, 2 classes that was just web design 1 and 2, and that's kind of what introduced me to it.
Okay, sounds good. Well, those are all of my questions. If any students have any other last minute questions for Maria, please put them in the chat box for her, and I will ask them for you. While I have you guys contemplating questions, if you have any, I also wanted to input in the chat box a survey link for you to complete a survey, just so that we can kind of get feedback from you on your thoughts on the BizChat, and that way we can make sure that we do successful and beneficial events for you in the future. So please follow that BizChat link there in the chat box to complete that short survey. Okay. We have one other question for you, Maria. Sorry, it's from a student. Do you ever get stuck or have art block on a design?
Oh, all the time, honestly, especially with my freelance work. I've been sometimes, depending on the project, it's mostly just for fun when it comes to freelance for me. And I'll just start drawing what idea pops in my head, and then I'll start drawing it, not liking it. I actually have a project right now that I haven't touched in a couple months. And I've had projects where I haven't even touched in a year, just because like I liked it at first, and then as I was drawing it, I just did not like it. But I kind of have to force myself to finish stuff, because a lot of times you start things but never finish them. And I'm actually starting to design a couple enamel pins just for fun. So I'm also kind of in the works for those. But yeah, definitely I do get artist block a lot. Kind of one thing that motivates me, I'm a part of this One Digital Artist Facebook group that on the daily, I see people post their artwork all the time. So that is kind of a motivator. And it kind of just comes down to, you got to draw every day. That way you get in that mindset and you don't become lazy. Because I've definitely had those days where as a graphic designer, I go to work and then I do all the graphic design work and artistic work. And then I come home and then I'm too exhausted to do my own personal artwork. So it's kind of like you need to find a balance.
Sounds good. Thank you. We have one other question from a student. Have you ever experienced any discrimination in your workplace?
Not terribly that I've been aware of. I've definitely, just as a minority, experienced it just on a day-to-day basis. And there was one time when I was interning at a company that my father actually was the president of the company. So I definitely could sense when some coworkers were kind of buttering up to me just because my father was their boss. So I've had those experiences, but you kind of just have to rub it off the shoulder, you know?
Yeah. So then while you were talking, I actually had one other question for you. I know you have a LinkedIn profile.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain to me why you see benefit and value in having a LinkedIn profile as a graphic designer?
Oh, definitely. Because like on a weekly basis, I see people view my LinkedIn profile all the time. And that way it's just another networking platform. It's really just like the Facebook version, but for business. And I've networked with a lot of people, and it kind of keeps me in touch with even some of my old uni professors as well. It's kind of cool to stay in contact with them. If they even see anything come up and want to reach out to me, that's always a plus.
Yeah, that sounds good. We really try to encourage our students into creating LinkedIn profiles, as we know networking and staying in touch with networking contacts they've formed while in college, it's really beneficial in their professional career. So I appreciate you speaking to that and the importance of that LinkedIn profile. So I appreciate that. Okay, any last questions for Maria before we end the BizChat today? While you're thinking of that question, I also am going to put in the chat her website. So if you have any time, you can kind of tinker around in her website and see her work. Sorry, I sent that privately to a student. Here it is for everyone. So go ahead and check out her website, and you can look at her work for your free time and see some of the different stuff that she's been working on. Okay. Thank you so much for everyone that's been on the Zoom call. Thank you, Mariah, for taking the time to be on the BizChat with us and speak to being a graphic designer for our students. And I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you so much. Okay, bye guys. Bye, Mariah, thank you.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.